although probably many of us do not have memories of this simple rural life that Anna Murray Robertson Moses, also known as Grandma Moses, painted, but especially at Christmas time, we love to be reminded of that early Americana. I, for one, am looking forward to hearing about this remarkable woman and seeing her depictions of life in the first half of the 19th century. So welcome to Rev Daniel Drew, whose grandmother met her second cousin, Grandma Moses, in Mount Liberty, Ohio, when Grandma Moses came for a Robertson reunion in 1941. Reverend Drew and his family also visited Grandma Moses in her home in upstate New York, and he has obviously collected many pieces of her art and stories about her life, prints, books, and magazine articles, and he also has an original painting at his home. Reverend Daniel Drew is a clergy member of the East Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church and has pastored churches in Cleveland, Chardon, Garfield Heights, Utica, and Mount Vernon, Ohio, as well as churches in Indiana and Maryland. He also served as the Cleveland District Superintendent. He is retired and lives with his wife, Debbie, on Lamberton Road in Cleveland Heights. And tonight we have with us his brother, Irvin, and his wife, Dawn. Now, I met Reverend Drew one day in Havens Park when I was trying to water those poor little plants when it was so dry. But we struck up a conversation and I learned of his connection to Grandma Moses. That was during the pandemic shutdown, so we weren't having any programs here, so that was a problem. But now the wait is over, and we are most fortunate to hear from someone who has such a direct connection to this American icon. Welcome, Daniel Drew.
Thank you, Georgiana. I appreciate that so much. I'm very, very happy to be here and to help share this life of Grandma Moses with you tonight. As you can see, we have quite a large number of memorabilia, all started by our mother. When Grandma Moses was rising in fame, my mother cut every article out of every paper and keep them. And my brother lived in California, so his collection came kind of eclectically, and then of course a lot of the things I received after my mother's death, the things I received before my mother's death or that she collected are all here. I want to begin tonight by sharing something new with you. Grandma Moses died in December of 1961. So that would be 60 years ago, right? 60 years ago, actually next week, she passed away. So it's kind of hard to remember people who, have been gone that long. And let's face it, you were all very young in 1961 when she passed away. But her fame grew exponentially over the next few years. So when you were younger adults, you probably remember the Grandma Moses memorabilia. There were fabric, paintings made into fabric that were into curtains, lampshades. There's a lot of memorabilia like the plates that you can see, mugs, all kinds of things that, she was one of the first artists that was able to, well, she didn't do it, but they marketed her very, very well. So I'm going to begin with a story about today. Because obviously you're young enough to want to know what's happening now, right? The current events, the things that are going on, and how does this person who died 60 years ago have anything to do with today's world and culture? So my son, for my birthday this year, brought me this book, and it's called Gatecrashers, The Rise of Self-Taught Artists in America. It's currently an art show in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is the program book. When you see everything in the show, you know, and you go out the door, they have obviously a gift table, and this is the book. There's one whole chapter on Grandma Moses. And I want to begin by sharing this to show you that this is very pertinent, up-to-date story. And I've obviously told the story about Grandma Moses as our family relative to the famous American many times. But this is the first time I've ever been able to share this because it's brand new. And the chapter is entitled Goodwill Grandma. And the article, the essay is really about, the show is really about gatecrashers, the people who were artists who weren't trained as artists, who didn't have the luxury of going to art school, who were not in the culture to grow up to be an artist. African Americans, in Moses' case, a woman who had very little education, and how they succeeded in gatecrashing that art world with the sophistication and the learning and the training that went into that. The chapter about her is very interesting because it's really about, in the 1950s, early 50s, they took her art to Austria, to Paris, and to the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and there were great crowds that came to see her work. In here, there's actually a playbill that advertises these museum shows, and here they are. And it's simply signed Grandma Moses, her signature. So you imagine being on the street of Paris or being in Austria, and here's a poster with this woman's signature on it. And very, very small, the painting, but large, the signature. And the show was an enormous success. People lined the crowds. People came and stood in line for a long period of time so they could get in to see the shows. Now, this really irritated the people who were really in the art world, who didn't think she was a very good artist and didn't think she, cut the mustard as a real American artist. And the backstory is that it was after World War II, right? It was the end of World War II, just 5 years earlier. And so we were trying to make good relations with the Austrians, the people who had bombings in their country where the war was fought. And we wanted them to think well of America. And her agent was Austrian himself, so he was able to get these set up. And actually, he had left Vienna because the Nazis were threatening him, and he was afraid that he would not survive. So he left his art museum in Vienna, came to New York, discovered Grandma Moses, set up a museum in an art gallery in New York. And then here it is in the 1950s, he's sending art back and is able to set up these shows. And they were a great success. And it stunned, it allowed people to see America in the primitive American art. It was allowed us to see America as a pastoral place rather than a warmongering nation, which we had, obviously helped to win the war with. It helped also to, the other thing I'll remind you was going on is that 1950s was the height of McCarthyism. And Senator McCarthy had the Un-American Activities Committee, and he was convinced that all the artists were communists. So some of the real artists that had gone to art school and had done real well and were very popular in American culture were being investigated and degraded in some ways. So this was a non-controversial little old lady, who gave no political opinions about anything. And so it succeeded. Actually, they had tried in the earlier years, in the late 40s, they tried an art show with some of those other artists. And it it bombed. It was very, very unpopular. So this was a great show. So this is the 2021 edition about Grandma Moses. She's still making the headlines and making the way. As Georgiana mentioned, she was Anna Mary Robertson, and if you know some Robertsons in central Ohio, they're probably related to Grandma Moses. Two of her uncles came here in the 1840s, Ezra and Hezekiah. My brother and I, our great-grandfather was Ezra, and then his brother Hezekiah. And they started, they both had families and they had multiple children. And so what do families do? After a few years and the grandparents are starting to, die off generation, they start to get together. So they began to have Robertson reunions. The Robertson reunion, the first one was in 1900. So Grandma Moses came to the Robertson reunion in 1941. The Robertsons had been having reunions for 41 years. She came to Ohio at that time. She wanted to see her Ohio cousins. She was a farm wife, and she and her husband had worked on farms their whole lives. And so she was kind and brought, because she stayed in our grandmother's, it was called a tourist home. Remember tourist homes? Yeah. That was before bed and breakfast, right? So they had a tourist home in Mount Liberty, Ohio on Route 3, State Route 3. And before you got to Columbus, you could stay overnight in their home. And we actually were looking tonight at the registry book, all in pencil, about people who were from Medina and from, places far away, and traveling down. And they stayed overnight. And one of the names is Anna Robertson. And when she left, she gave my grandmother, for the gratuity of staying in her home for this reunion, which had been the day before. So the next morning, as they're beginning to leave, she gets out of the car some jam, some jelly, some relishes that she had made. And then she hands her a painting and says, "I'm rather well known back east." And of course, that was, nobody knew. Actually, it was August of 1941, and in the 41 New York State Fair, she had just won the Amateur Artist of the Year award. So she begins that journey, and by the time I was born, there was actually an autobiographical book about her. My parents bought the book and read it, and they had this painting, left from what she gave to my grandmother, who died, was it the next year? She died that in 42. So my mother had the painting. Her husband lived with us, my grandfather, and so we had the painting, and my mother began to see these books, articles, newspapers, some of which I brought tonight, that you can actually see these old stories that she was collecting about this famous person. And so my father and mother read the autobiography of Grandma Moses. My father wrote her a poem and sent it to her, and she said, "Why don't you come for a visit?" So in 1952, we went to visit her. My father had bought a brand new car and had wanted to drive out. We had an aunt who lived stayed in the summer in New Hampshire, and so we drove through upstate New York, stopped to see Grandma Moses. And so there we are with Grandma Moses. I'm the smallest one. And my brother is also in the picture. I would usually say something like he's older, and he remembers more than I do. But he also brought many things. You can look at his table. He's also got some very nice things that he brought with us. So we went to see her. Grandma Moses was born on September the 7th, 1860. I was born on September the 6th, And sometimes I say that I'm 1 day older than Grandma Moses. And occasionally I feel like it, but you know. So she's actually, I am almost 4 in the picture. I'll be 4 the next month, and she will be 92.
Wow.
And we went in 1957, and we went in 1959, and we went in 1961 and saw her in her nursing home. And she died on December 13th of 1961. So I want to tell you a story about a remarkable woman. She grew up out in the country of Washington County, the mountains of upstate New York, east of the Hudson, and near the Vermont line. We talked about that a little bit earlier, some of you. So her museum today is in Bennington, Vermont. One of the stories she tells in her autobiography is her first knowledge about the world and how difficult it was to get to town. They lived in the country, and to go to town was, you got to hook the horses up, you got to have something to take to town to sell, as well as to buy provisions. And so she remembers going to town with her mother, and when they got to town, the shops were bunted in black bunting. And her mother said to the shopkeeper, "Oh my, whatever happened?" Lincoln is killed, so she's 4 years old and the man said to her, she remembers this as a small child, "Oh, ma'am, President Lincoln is dead." Can you imagine? Living in the country and having no clue, no idea what had happened. You have to go to town to find out that the president had died. So that's how rural she grew up. When she was asked, she was a very articulate, intelligent woman who said to somebody earlier, she matches wits with Edward R. Murrow, when she's interviewed in 1955 by Edward R. Murrow, one of the greatest commentators of his day. And she's very, very, and she writes well. So somebody asked her once, "Well, tell us about when you went to school." And she said, "Well, we didn't go to school much." She said, "There were too many chores to do. We went a little bit in the spring and in the fall, but we didn't have clothes either, not warm clothes to go to school." So she really didn't get much of an education at all. And then at age 12, she was one of 10 children. And at age 12, her parents did to her what I would seem to be unconscionable today. They sent her away to work. So she left the home at age 12 to become the farm girl for a neighbor family who happened to also be cousins and relatives. And so she was the farm girl. She went to work at age 12, and she actually never goes home again to be a child. She works from 12, got to be bigger farms, but she was the farm girl, which meant that she took care of the garden. And so she knew about the canning and making preserves and jams and jellies. She helped to cook the meals. She took care of the one horse. They didn't have a farm man. She got the horse ready to go to church. She was the farm hand, if you will. She works on 4 different farms, and by the time she's 27 years old, she's working on a much larger farm, and they do have a farm man, and his name is Thomas Moses. And these 2 workers are working the farm, falling in love, thinking about what, they didn't have to work on somebody else's farm. It's 1887, and what was happening in 1887? The Civil War was over. The South was looking for people to come and farm the farms because they couldn't always enlist slaves or ex-slaves to farm. So there were actually ads in the northern papers to come farm this farm, a rental farm. They didn't have enough money to buy a farm. So they got married at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they caught the 5:30 train out of town. Went all the way down to New York City, first day. Second day went all the way to Washington, D.C. Third day they went all the way to Staunton, Virginia. And these two people who had worked on farms their entire lives, 3 days of riding on a train was enough. They were going to Georgia to rent a farm in Georgia. They had a newspaper ad. They were going to Georgia, but they were walking the street of Staunton, Virginia that night after being on the train for 3 days. And sure enough, there were ads. You could rent a farm right there, go to work. And so they lived in this, they bought a farm, or they rented farms in the Shenandoah Valley. She lives in the Shenandoah Valley from 1887 to 1911. In the Shenandoah Valley, she said she left the Shenandoah Valley with her husband, their livestock, and some of their household goods, and 5 children. She said that she had 10 children down in the Shenandoah Valley and left 5 small graves. So she did, as I said, they didn't own a farm. They just worked the farms, several different farms. But she's also very industrious. She's worked since she's 12 years old. So she's a very industrious woman. She asks Thomas to bring her in some milk from the cow and cream, she said, and don't look, and you'll see what I'm going to make. And she remembered how to make butter. And so she went into town and she said, how much would you give for a pound of butter? And they told her, and she took 1 penny less and said, well, I'll sell it to you for a penny less. And she was a very popular butter maker. She also figured out how to make French fries. Well, we would call French sliced potatoes really thin. We would call them potato chips today, but she sliced potatoes really, really thin and cooked them in the oil. So she was a very industrious and prosperous woman, even though she didn't depend upon Thomas and his 1910, my brother just pointed this out to me today, that 1910, their parents die, and so there's a farm, there's the things to do back north, and so they moved back to where they had grown up and where they had met, Washington County, New York. And they now are able to buy a farm. So 1911, she's 51 years old. She's 51 years old, and they buy their first farm. First property that they could actually buy. And of course, if you've ever been to upstate New York, it's very mountainous, very hilly. You'll see the hills. All the paintings are all about hills. And so they buy a farm on a hill, and it's their place. It's going to be the first Moses farm, and she names it Mount Nebo. Now, she mentioned that I was a preacher. So this is my favorite question. Why would you name your farm Mount Nebo?
Is that where the ark landed?
No.
That was
Ararat, yes. But it's a really good guess. One of my favorite places to go, actually. Their name was Moses. And Moses wanders in the wilderness for 40 years with the people, remember? And he gets to a place called Mount Nebo. And he looks over and he can see the promised land. And God says to him, you can't go there. And Moses dies on Mount Nebo. So in 1911, told you she did see, for not being a very educated person, she figured out a lot of things, right? They named their farm Mount Nebo, the place to own and to die, and to live until they die. In 1927, Thomas dies. Thomas did not like her dawdling with art. She always loved to draw figures and to paint things. One time when she was refurbishing the house, the quarters, she had wallpaper. She ran out of wallpaper. Rather than go to the store and buy some more wallpaper, she painted the wall, the fireboard. And so she loved to paint. They say that her father actually would get the paints in the summertime by the clay, by the pond. In the summertime, August, the pond goes down, right? It's really dry. And you could scrape around the top of the pond, the rim of the pond, and there was enough clay there that they could make red paint. And her father would bring home newsprint. And that was a delight for them to be able to paint something. Thomas did not like painting. And of course, she was hardworking with all those other chores that farm women did. And so she never paints until after Thomas dies. Actually, the story of her painting is an interesting one. She actually, so she's doing all the farm work and wife work, making jams, jellies, relishes, and canning. And she loved to make pictures, landscapes with worsted wool. Now, a couple of years ago, here's another show book. We were able to go to this show. It was in Dayton, Ohio. We traveled around the country several places, but it actually starts in with Grandma Moses' worsted wool landscapes. The landscapes she made out of yarn. And so that was her first love. And as I said, this is the show book of that. And I remember going to this in Dayton, Ohio, and seeing that, she had a whole other life, of course, before she was an artist. And one of them was to make things with worsted wool. And then she says, that she had this problem, maybe you've heard about it. She had arthritis. Anybody ever have that? She said it made it very hard to do that worsted wool with arthritis. So her daughter said to her, "Mom, why don't you paint?" So she began to paint. 78 years old when she began to paint. So I want to tell you a remarkable story about a woman who began to paint when she was 78 years old and became world famous, still internationally known, still talking about her in 2021. Now there's a couple things about Grandma Moses that are very unusual. I think maybe I'll tell you about the discovery. That's a great story. So let me tell you about the discovery first. So she's painting. And we have a couple paintings here. I'll talk about them a little bit as we go to close. Let me do this one. Somebody said to her, "Well, Grandma, how do you decide how big the painting should be?" And she said, "Well, I go out to the barn and I find some wood and I make a frame." And she said, "And then I know how big it'll be." She said, "You wouldn't get a horse until you had a barn to put it in." So, and the story of her discovery is rather remarkable. So she paints for fun. She's not doing it for money. She's doing it because it's something to do with her arthritis. And she begins to paint, and she puts the pictures up at Thomas's store. Now, Thomas's store was in Hoosick Falls. And in Hoosick Falls, there's this little store. We would call it a general store. And she put her paintings in the women's section. You know what the women's section is? It's not what you think. It's where the women sell their things. The local women sell bonnets and things that they made, hand goods, those jams and jellies. And so above the display, they put these paintings up there. And of course, nobody ever bought one, but she put them up there anyway. And so in 1939, a man comes from New York City, and he stops at Music Falls to stretch his legs and go into Thomas's store and maybe get some refreshment. And he sees these paintings. His name was Louis Calder. He's actually a Hungarian immigrant, also escaped from the Nazis in 1939. And he likes these paintings, and he actually buys them all. And then he asks, are there any more of them? And they said, well, you know, she just lives up the road there. You can go up and ask. I don't know if she's got it or not. And so he goes up to the house, and he says, I just bought the paintings. They never sold a painting, so they're so excited, never sold a painting. And he says, I'd like to buy all of them. And the daughter said, well, Grandma's not here right now. I can't sell the paintings because she's not here. And he said, well, I'll come back tomorrow. How many do you think there are? How many can I buy? She said, well, I think there are 10 out in the barn. So, yeah, come back tomorrow. So she, Grandma comes home that night and says, guess what? We sold a painting. And by the way, they asked her, how much do you sell the paintings for? This is when she was famous, of course. She said, well, I sell them $3 for small and $5 for large. One time I gave this talk, I don't know, 2 weeks later, I'm driving my car, somebody called me up, an old friend calls me up. They just sold to Grandma Moses for $45,000. She sold them for $5.
Yeah.
So Louis Calder buys her paintings. They told her, there's 10. I told him there'd be 10 in the barn for her. So she goes out and paints, counts the paintings, and guess what? There were 9. And she said, now, Grandma's 79 years old. She said she didn't want to disappoint the nice man with a foreign accent in a big black car. So she better make it 10, right? So what do you think she did? She took the biggest painting and cut it in half. And so there were 10 paintings. That story is actually in one of the books I have here. It was bought in so he buys it from her in 1939. He deals it, and it goes to those two paths go to 2 collectors. And actually, they discovered this in 1969. 30 years later, they discovered these 2 pieces of painting actually go together, owned by different people at that point in time. Now, why you were surprised about that is that one of the things that one of the qualities is that she actually paints not on canvas, but remember I said she got the frames from the old wood around the garage or the barn? She painted on masonite boards. That's how she began her painting career. On old pieces of lumber and wood and masonite that were around. Remember what masonite looks like? Very dark, right? So one of the reasons that I even suggested that I would come tonight or in the December, it's a fun show to do near the holidays, because what we all recognize about Grandma Moses' paintings is half of them, most of them are very white.
Yeah.
They're very white. That's because to get masonite to have a picture on it, she put 5 coats of white paint on them first to bleach out all that darkness. And so now she's got a whiteboard to paint from. So as you can see in this painting called The Frosty Day, it's easy to do for white, right? Because she's actually working with snow and clouds and sky that are all in that spirit of the whiteness from the old masonite boards. Well, the story of Louis Calder is very interesting because then Louis Calder he's not a dealer. He wants to sell the paintings to a dealer. Actually, Louis Calder later became an art critic for the New York Times. And he's looking for an art dealer, and he's starting to talk about these paintings, and he can't find an art dealer. Nobody's interested in the paintings. Somebody asked him, how old is the artist? And when you said, well, she's 80 years old, he said, well, forget that. You know, who wants to be the agent for somebody who's 80? Because, you know, well, there was a guy named Otto Clear. And Otto Clear, he wrote the big book. Otto Clear was a Hungarian immigrant an Austrian from Vienna. And he wanted very badly to get started in the art world in America because he'd run away from the Nazis. Calder had run away from the Nazis from Hungary. And so they agreed to meet on 57th Street at night. And Otto Clear, who becomes her agent, looks at the paintings by flashlight in the back of a car and decides to buy them. And he told his family when he left, if I don't come back, it was the Nazis, and they got me. They actually thought that, you know, they were afraid that the Nazi hunters were going to take them back. So he desperately wants to become an art agent. He didn't care that Grandma Moses was 80 years old. And did he ever hit the jackpot? She lived for 21 more years. She painted 5 paintings at a time. She has 1,600 registered paintings in her name. 21. Can you imagine how lucky guy this was? He just hit the jackpot. He got an artist that was, you know, actually in one of the program book I just showed you, there's actually a cartoon of an artist, is, you know, kind of starving artist looking at his easel, and, you know, and it's obvious that he's, you know, poor and he's not made any money lately, and his wife opens the door and she yells, Grandma Moses didn't need inspiration. Grandma Moses didn't need, you know, she just painted every day. You know, and part of the reason I mentioned that she had 1,600 registered Grandma Moses paintings is the one I have is not registered. A lot of people she would paint for, or someone she would do a painting, and someone would say, oh, I really like that. Would you paint me one? And so she'd say, oh yeah, I'll do that. One of the most famous ones is the Checkered House. And so this is a famous building. It was, I have 2 versions of it here. She painted it, this is obviously winter. This is a spring painting. She painted the roof of the Checkered House many times. She painted it for different people. She painted it in different seasons. The Checkered House, everybody remembered. I'm trying to think what it would be like. How about the fish house restaurant on the 9th Street Pier? Anybody remember that? There used to be a fish house you could go down. Captain Frank's. How many of you remember Captain Frank's? Well, that's the kind of painting that Grandma Moses would do, because the Checkered House burned in 1911. It was 30 years later. No, it wasn't around, but she painted paintings of it, and everybody wanted one. Well, I remember that house. And it was, you know, Stagecoach Inn. She's got one with Revolutionary soldiers in it, because it was around from the time of the Revolution until 1911 when it burned. So when she was painting this, she was painting something that people would remember and maybe want. And so there was quite a number of paintings that she gave away. She didn't understand the value of the paintings, and she painted things that people requested them. She would paint them again and again. So she the number of her actual paintings, you know, nobody really knows, but there are 1,600 registered Grandma Moses paintings. Actually, I took mine to Jane Clear, the granddaughter of Otto Clear, and took a photo of it, to New York City, to their gallery. Jane Clear still runs the gallery on 57th Street that her grandfather started. And when I showed her the painting, I think she probably thought I wanted money for it, which I really didn't. I just wanted to know it. She said, "Oh, that." She said, "We have a dozen of those in the bag." She went back and got one, not the same, but similar, to it. And I wasn't trying to sell it, but the point is that there were a lot of paintings that she did very similarly, day at a time. One of the interesting piece about her paintings, I mentioned she painted 5 paintings at a time. Now, Grandma Moses was a Robertson, and she, like our mother, my brother, myself, as she would say, we're all Scottish. And that meant that they were very frugal. Did you ever hear that about Scottish people? Very frugal Scottish people. How many Scots do we have here tonight? Anybody? Yeah. Very frugal, so you can't throw things away, right? So she painted 5 paintings at a time because when she had the black paint out, rather than just paint a little bit on this one, she would paint the black paint for this painting, the black paint for this painting, the back paint for this painting, the back. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what she had in her mind to know where she was going to use it, what each of those paintings was going to be, and where she would need the paint of that color at that time? So it's quite remarkable, her vision, her memory, and what she painted. Well, actually, I will. Let me pass out to you while I'm talking a little bit. I'll also pass out some calendars. In the old days, the 1990s, 1991, 2, 3, Grandma Moses' calendar was something you just had to buy, So I'll just pass a couple of calendars out, and then, by the way, I passed out 4 calendars, so there's 48 paintings for you to look at just as I'm talking to you. But I want to talk to you about the paintings themselves, a little bit about her art technique. But before I do that, I want to tell you another story. So Grandma Moses she's quite a character. Part of what made her become the icon that she was that she had great, she was just a real character. Like I said, she didn't do this for money. But other people obviously made a lot of money, and the paintings became well worth something. So 1946, the war's over, and Auto Clear has now been her dealer art dealer for 5 years, 6 years. And he takes some of the paintings to Hallmark, and they agree to make Christmas cards out of the paintings. And they give, the commission was $1,600. $1,600. So he comes to her and he says, "Grandma, I sold your paintings to Hallmark. They're going to make Christmas cards out of them. And here's a check for $1,600. She said, "Well, I can't take that. You already paid me for the paintings." And they argued. She said, "I can't take that." And he said, "Just take it." I can't take that. And then she said, "You can't sell a jar of preserves twice." And she was sure that she couldn't sell a painting twice either. So the next time Auto Clear comes to buy some more paintings from her, on the kitchen table there's a stack of $1 bills. And he says to her, "Oh, Grandma, what's this?" She said, "That's that money you gave me, but it's not mine. Just take some." And everybody who came by her house takes some money. It's not mine, She was not going to have anything to do with that $1,600 that she didn't deserve. But that gives you a little chance to see her personality and her spirit. She doesn't take herself seriously. She's not doing this for the money. She's doing it for the fun of it. And somebody asked her once, "Are you getting better as you're painting?" She said, "Well, I don't know, but the paints are getting a lot better and the brushes are much better. Actually, to talk about that frugal Scottish piece, during World War II, she did many paintings with the leftover piece of that stick match. Remember those matchsticks you lit a fire with? And then you blew it out and you had this much matchstick left. Well, instead of throwing it away, you could make a paintbrush out of that. So she wasn't sure if her painting got better, but the brushes were much better. So let me move along to just a couple other highlight stories. So here's a woman who is not well educated, who doesn't have a career, she's a farm wife. As a matter of fact, in 1941, that same year she came to see us at Christmas time, the Auto Clear took her to a gimbal store to set off the Christmas season. Now, we would call it the Thanksgiving Day Parade, today, and, the football games would be on Black Friday. But in Gimbals, then it was just, we're going to start the season, and we'll have a program. So remember, department stores had, up on top, they had a dining room, and a ballroom, and it was a kind of a place where people went, and it was a gala. And they decided, so Auto Clear did a show called What a Farm Wife Painted. That was the name of the first show, What a Farm Wife Painted. And when she goes to this, there's actually a famous painting of her leaving to go. She goes to the big city, 1941. And she took with her and put on the stage, I'm sure they set up the paintings, but on the stage she brought squash and pumpkins. And someone said, we want to talk about the painting. Why'd you bring the vegetables? She said, I don't know anything about painting. I just know about the vegetables. And if I run out of something to talk about, I can talk about the vegetables. 1948, her book comes out, and she gets a prize from the Women's National Women's Club in Washington, D.C. And the person who gave the honorees their awards was Harry Truman. He happened to be president of the United States at the time. And interestingly enough, it's written about her getting this award, and she goes to Washington, obviously, and gets that, stays in the Blair House, and she gets this award. Interestingly enough, if you read carefully the article, the other woman who was recognized that day was a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the widow of the ex-president, had her own name and fame. But all the stories are about this little lady artist because she's unknown. She also has some wonderful stories about Truman. So one of them is so they're at the Blair House after this, and President Truman is going to leave. He's had this little talk with Chairman Moses. He's done his duty, and he's going to go back to the White House. And he gets to the door, and it's raining really hard. And Truman says, I'm not going out in that. And he comes back over, and he sat down and played the piano, as Harry Truman liked to do. And she said, I could talk to Harry. He was just like one of my boys. So let me do this painting then. This brings me to this one. So when we went in 1952, my father noticed that there was an easel with a painting on it. And my father said, of course, is that one of your paintings? And she said, no, that's that guy who's running for president. He painted his farm and sent it to me, so anything to get a vote. And his name was Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a painter. He loved it, and he sent a painting to her, and she said to my father, well, anything for a vote. She actually had quite a relationship with Eisenhower. Eisenhower got sick, pneumonia in 1956. She wrote him a note and said, now take care of yourself, young man. When she died in 1961, she was eulogized by John F. Kennedy. So she had a relationship with 3 presidents of the United States, this little farm wife who didn't have much of a background or education. But I want to talk about this painting tonight. This is actually the one that she gave to Truman. Auto Clear arranged that it be given to Truman as a recognition of his presidency. It's called the 4th of July. And it's the Bennington 4th of July celebration, Bennington, Vermont. See? So And in the parade, you can see they're coming out of the church probably, the town hall, and they're making a parade. And there's kind of a parade, and they're going around. And then there's the parade master is in the car, and the car is being pulled by the horses. She really liked things old-fashioned. It's like so, and the boys are playing ball. There's a lot of color in this painting. This painting has a wonderful story. If you've read J.B. West's book, Upstairs at the White House usher for 30-some years. So J.B. West tells the story in his book that this painting was in his office. It was given to the Trumans, right, in the honor of the Truman presidency. Eisenhower reportedly didn't like the painting at all. Maybe he didn't like Grandma Moses' paintings, but so he banned it from the White House and gave it to J.P. West, the head usher, who hung it in his office. And when the Kennedys moved into the White House and they were redecorating, Jacqueline comes downstairs to ask J.B. West a question. And she says, "Oh, Mr. West, you have a Grandma Moses painting." And he said, "No, ma'am, you have a Grandma Moses painting. This belongs to the White House. You can do whatever you want with it." And she said, "Could I really, Mr. West? I'd so love to have it in Caroline's room." So this painting was in Caroline's room, along with the French Impressionists. In the Nixon years, and during the Nixon years, the other thing that's very famous about this painting is they made it into a 6 cents first class stamp. Do you remember 6 cent first class stamps? Now the interesting thing about this is that this painting has 6 colors in it. So if you're going to print, you have to run it through the press for each color, right? So can you imagine the government running stamps through a press 6 different times? But that's what was done during the Nixon administration. So this is a very famous painting, and that's where it still belongs to the White House. I want to just, I said she's a very famous person. I want to just mention this. So here's this farm wife who has no education, no knowledge. She makes the cover of Time magazine, 1953. And as I mentioned to Georgiana, women didn't make the cover of Time magazine. Matter of fact, I've seen that big poster with all the Time magazines. They're all men until, the golden my year begins. But Grandma Moses did it in 1953. So we have a number of paintings. You've got some things to look at. I want to talk to you about one painting, and then I'll stop for questions or whatever. But let me talk about this painting for a moment. Don, do you want to be my Vanna White and hold this for me? So if you will, Don, it's my sister-in-law, Don, and she has not heard these stories before, right? Not at least from me, from Brother Irv, maybe. So I want to talk to you about the painting itself. Let me just take one painting. We won't talk about all of them, but let me just say a couple words about this painting. And I love this one. It's called A Frosty Day. Now, there are really several things that you could know about Grandma Moses' paintings. I mentioned to you that she was painting. She wanted them all to be, they were all white first. So she's working out of the whiteness. She says that she painted from the sky down. So she painted the sky first. Many people commented about the fact that she was a farmer's wife. What's important to farmers?
Weather.
The weather. What's it going to be? That tells the whole day, what's going to happen today, what's going to happen tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow. The sky is the clue. So she paints the sky first. The second thing is that Jane Clear, I didn't make this up, Jane Clear says, these are not really landscapes. These are what we call memoryscapes. She's not painting a picture of, like a photograph of the landscape. She's painting everything she can remember about a frosty day. What happens on a frosty day? So this scene, and almost all of these paintings, you'll see there's a lot of activity, enormous energy in it. So here there's a mill. And the mill has a wheel, and there's water coming off the wheel. And you can almost see the water coming off the wheel, because it's not coming down like a straight line, like some artists would draw, but rather it's just kind of splashing off the wheel. And the same is true with the movement of the animals. You know, one horse's foot is up and one foot is down to indicate that movement, that energy. So someone's bringing something into the mill to be milled. Somebody else is taking out the finished product. Someone's bringing other things are going on in the picture. Over here, the kids are playing a game, and over here they're like ice skating like hockey on this little pond. So there's a number of activities. It's not what you'd see if you took a picture. It's what Grandma remembered about frosty days and in that. And so the other thing that's important about almost all the Grandma's paintings is that there are really three different pieces to it. One is this lower piece, which is really the activity center. This is what you look at it and you say, oh, that's, you know, a frosty day, or making maple syrup, or bringing home the Christmas tree, or catching the Thanksgiving turkey. But then there's another part to the painting which gives you distance. It's up out of the village into the country. And on this side, in this painting, in this part of the painting, you can see that there is a farmer who has brought out hay to the cattle. With snow on the ground, there's nothing to eat unless someone brings them the hay. And you can almost see the three cows, they're all kind of moving towards the hay. You can kind of see that movement in there. So there's kind of the initial scene, the secondary scene, and the third scene is the sky, the clouds, the rain, the mountains in the distance. And she called this, and big artists who studied her called this her view of eternity, off to the distance, off to the farther than the eye can see. And it gives her great depth in her paintings. It's one of her true gifts. Thank you, John. And I think you'll see that illustration I gave rings true for many of the paintings. Well, sure. I really appreciate your time, and obviously I have too many things to tell you about, but hopefully I told you the good stories and the funny ones, and our relationship with the three presidents of the United States, and about her popularity in Europe. Most of her paintings now, many of them are owned by people in the Orient. She's very popular in Japan. Yeah. So do you have some questions you'd like to?
Thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great. So who has a question? Art, you're the artist. What do you think of her art?
I think it's terrific. I'm reminded there was a,
Wait a minute.
I'm sorry.
Let everybody hear.
We have a
Hold
painting
it up.
by a man whose name is Patton. I think he was superintendent of schools in Independence, Ohio, or one of the suburbs in that direction. He was born in a town in southern Ohio called Ricks Mills. Ricks Mills was one of those towns that was strip mined out of existence. So he's painting Ricks Mills, and has a whole series of paintings on board. I think it's masonite. And I was lucky enough to be able to buy one. But they're very much like these. There's no perspective. It's essentially a flat landscape. The houses pay no attention to the relative size between the house and the tree. They're all the same size,
Hold it to your mouth.
but they are very appealing paintings,
Okay.
as are these.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great.
Dawn?
Who is Will Moses?
Oh, okay.
What was the question?
Who is Will Moses?
Oh.
I did on one corner here have my Will Moses stuff. So Will's an active living artist today. He is her great-grandson. He was born in 1958. He lives in the house that they bought and built after 1911 on the, what was that place called? Mount Nebo. And if you go there to his barn, you can go into his studio and see his paintings. He's rather well known. There are books. If you see an art auction, you will see the name Moses. It's not Grandma Moses, it's Will Moses today. He mostly illustrates books. He uses her style, kind of primitive style, but he doesn't have that kind of imagination like Grandma did, just painting out of memory or out of something that would be happy or gay. But he is a very famous well-known artist now, yes.
Does her work come for auction very frequently?
No, I don't know that it auctions off very, very much. I mean, obviously, occasionally it does, but most of it's privately owned, and I don't know, what happens when the state comes up and they want to sell it or something like that. But you don't hear of Grandma Moses auctions or paintings. How many of you have been to Malabar Farm in Ohio? Okay. I gotta mention Malabar. So Louis Bromfield, award-winning.
She lives here in 1925?
Yes. I was just gonna say you're gonna leave my jacket though, right?
I'm going to put it over here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me.
I'm so glad you came. So I just want to say, Louis Bromfield is commissioned to write the introduction to her autobiography in 1948. Louis Bromfield doesn't know Grandma Moses, she doesn't know him. But, the publishers thought this would be a good thing because he was very famous by this time. And so he writes in the introduction to her autobiography that these are the paintings that any farmer would love to have in his house. That most paintings of farms are very dull. But these, as I mentioned, have that life and light to them. And if you've been to the olive farm, you remember, or if you haven't been and you're going to go to Malabar Farm, there are two original Grandma Moses paintings at Malabar. One is in the Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart honeymoon bedroom. There's an original Grandma Moses in there. And there's an original Grandma Moses as you walk down the stairs. If you're facing the stairs, it's on your left. So Louis Bromfield actually bought two of the Grandma Moses for himself. So it's just a little something you can do and see in Ohio. You can see some original Grandma Moses paintings.
Interesting. Well, I want to be sure everybody has a chance to look at all the memorabilia and the paintings. So,
Yes.
Janet?
Were there any artists that you know that she was influenced by?
She really didn't there's not any evidence of that because she really didn't study. She didn't, read other artists. She just did what she thought was fun and painted. And she didn't paint things that were very modern. There's one electrical pole in all of her paintings, and there's no wires attached to it. It's just standing there, like the horse drawing the car, and it's like kind of used. Now she did love to watch TV, and she watched TV and painted 5 hours a day in the last years of her life. So she was modern in many ways, but she didn't really, it's not like she could, I would say, I'll take myself back a little bit, to say one thing. When she got started, she studied Currier and Ives. Currier and Ives was how she began. She looked at magazine articles with Currier and Ives in it, and then she copied that painting. So she made, and the original that I have looks a little bit more like Currier and Ives than these paintings, because it's very, very early in her life. So that's a good question. talked myself into a new answer.
These are,
I was just gonna comment, if any of us have trouble sleeping at night, I wonder how she slept, because it seems like she has such a rich imagination that she could
Right,
recreate a whole world every painting.
exactly.
But I was just gonna remind people that in 1989, Great Lakes Theater Festival brought the one-man show that Cloris Leachman
Cloris
did.
Leachman, yes.
You may remember about Grandma Moses.
Yeah. Cloris Leachman did Grandma Moses, yes, that's right. And I always wanted to take my mother, we never did that, so. Yeah, Cloris Leachman did a one-woman show for years around the country of Grandma Moses. It took her 4 hours to put on the makeup, to look 90. But I imagine it was a wonderful, wonderful show.
Dexterity is amazing.
Pardon?
Dexterity.
Uh-huh.
Vision.
Absolutely. So let's think about that for a second. I'll tell you one last story.
Rage.
So she actually has a lot of dexterity. She has a lot of vision. She has a lot of imagination. She has a lot of memory. So I visited Grandma Moses with my brother and sister, my parents, 1952. There's another one back here, I can't find it right now, but 1957, 1959. Now these are 1 hour visits, 20, just a little time. And then 1961, we went to her room at the nursing home. By the way, she died at 101. They say she painted 36 paintings after 100 years old. And she would, and when we went to see her, she wanted to go home. She wanted to go home so she could paint. So they didn't let her paint in the nursing home. So she had to paint 36 paintings before she went there. So we came out of the car. My mother went into the room. I was restless, was I 11 or something like that? Maybe 12. And so I'm a restless young boy, and I've been in the car a long time. And my mother comes into the room and she says, Grandma, it's Ruth from Ohio. And then I come around the corner and she looked up at me. Can't tell now, but I had very curly hair. And she said, well, there's that curly haired boy from Ohio. I think about, how could she remember? I mean, what kind of memory she must have also had to somebody she's met a couple of times. She doesn't really know me, but I bounced around the corner and she said, there's that curly haired boy. Wow. So she also had great memory and vision at 101 to see that I was the curly haired boy. So yeah, a lot of gifts that she had, that's for sure.
How long did everyone call her Grandma Moses?
I don't know that there's ever a time they didn't. I think her own kids called her Grandma. Even in, like the story about selling the paintings in 39, they're saying, well, Grandma has some paintings out back. So at least the knowledge that I know of, she did.
The detail of dexterity is amazing.
Imagine doing it with a matchstick.
Yeah. Or a toothpick.
Did she ever just paint her own village or her own area? Is everything just from her imagination? Because it's a lovely depiction of life in a way, and it reminds me of the Bruegels, who used to do all these, including the flatness of the perspective and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered to see what life is like.
Yes. She didn't, like many artists would do, she didn't go out and sit, she did this in her home, in the comfort of her home. I mean, she didn't start till she was 80, so she doesn't set up an easel any place and, say I'm gonna paint that picture. She does do some memories, other than, she does some, somebody asked her once, Grandma, you'd really be great if you paint some Bible pictures. And she said, I wasn't there. So she said, and then she said, I don't think she believed very much in science fiction. She said, I couldn't paint anything from 2,000 years ago any more than I could paint something from 2,000 years from now. So she was a realistic dreamer, if you will. She did painted a few paintings a couple of times where she put stories with the painting, but you don't necessarily know the story from the painting. Like the one that was cut in half, that was the Shenandoah Valley painting, and she says later, his neighbors talking, like they're driving home and they've stopped to talk to the neighbors, and somebody said, what is that? And she said, well, they just learned about the Civil War battle, and they're coming to tell people that. Well, you can't get that from the painting. There's no like Civil War, but she's remembering something that happened that neighbors would talk to neighbors in that era of time that would have been very important, to talk about. So, but she doesn't very often. I said that in one of the paintings she's got a couple of Revolutionary War soldiers to indicate that the checkered house was there during the Revolution, but she doesn't like paint a Revolutionary War. There's a famous painting of the fire at Bennington. There was a bridge that burned at Bennington, and she paints the Bennington Bridge fire, kind of like a current event fire, but she obviously didn't see it. She may have seen a picture, but she didn't see the fire at Bennington. So yeah, it's mostly from her mind. So yeah, she, well, as I said, she is finally memorialized at the end by John F. Kennedy. She dies in 1961. Quite a remarkable story.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
And when you go out walking again, you kind of, and meet some other men out in the park, but this was a wonderful program.
Right, wasn't that a serendipitous
It
event?
was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
That was nice.
Thank you.
That was great. Good.